So, for maybe a couple months, I had been very enthusiastically recommended The Chosen by Dallas Jenkins as a series to watch. I was hearing nothing but praise from the people in my life who had watched it. I was seeing nothing but praise online. So, after a while, I did decide to watch the first episodes. I tried to set aside the fact that it is made by an evangelical Nepo baby whose father had a huge role in my rapture anxiety, and set aside his own personal politics too, and just engage with it for what it was. And I really think I went in with even more than an open mind. Like, I genuinely wanted this to be as good as everyone was telling me it is. I mean, not to, go into my whole life story, but I feel like this is relevant for my credentials for making a video about this topic. I was raised in the evangelical church, pretty conservative too, like not full on fundamentalist, but we shared spaces a lot with people who were like fundamentalist adjacent. We weren't allowed to watch Nickelodeon, okay? Over the past few years, I have been through like wave after wave of deconstruction. But the one thing that has been a constant through this whole process is that I've never like turned into a Jesus hater. I still think his ministry and his teachings are all revolutionary and incredible, and yeah, I'm still a big fan. So I wanted this to be good. And I mean it was. It definitely wasn't bad, especially not compared to some of the other pieces of media we're going to be talking about. I think there is a lot to appreciate about this series. I mean, first of all, at least season one, I think was pretty much entirely crowdfunded, so it's really impressive what they could do with that. And I really enjoyed Jonathan Rumi's portrayal of Jesus. So there is a lot to appreciate, but I mean, it's not a perfect show. And expecting it to be a perfect show would be kind of insane, except for the facts of how hard pressed you would be to organically come across any criticism for the show online. But as I was reading through reviews of The Chosen, there was a common sentiment that kept popping up over and over, and was basically people saying, look, I know the other Christian movies, they're shit. I hate them. Everyone should hate them. But The Chosen is different. The Chosen isn't like other girls, which shows that The Chosen is only being evaluated against a very, very specific set of media. And that got me thinking about all the Christian media I engaged with, when I was growing up in this culture, and how back then also people seemed very adverse to criticizing any of it. So today, together, we are going to set out to answer one of the most important questions about modern Christianity. And it's not predestination, it's not age of accountability, it's not pre or post millennialism. It's, why are Christian films like that? If we're trying to get a comprehensive view of where today's Christian entertainment stems from, we need to start at the church plays of the 15th and 16th centuries. In Europe, these plays were used as a method of ministry and were a notable innovation in making, religious doctrine and stories more accessible to the common person, especially in a time when mass printed books were kind of just starting to become a concept in Europe, and also translating the Bible into English could still get you executed. So these plays are broadly divided into three categories. You had morality plays, which featured heavily archetypal characters and were used to teach moral lessons to the audience. Mystery plays, which were dramatizations of biblical stories. And then miracle plays, which were stories of divine intervention and miracles, and were either semi biographical or completely fictitious accounts of the lives and works of saints. Well, as secular theater rose in prominence and as the Bible itself became more widely accessible, these church plays began to lose their cultural prevalence, but Their influence in modern Christian media and in modern narrative in general is still very apparent. All right, so flash forward a few hundred years, okay? We have cameras now. The pictures are moving. Everyone is losing their damn minds. The Bible and the lives of saints provided a wide cachet of stories for early silent films, ranging from previously lost media pieces on stories of Jesus' life that are still resurfacing today to films that have gone on to receive sweeping critical acclaim and even be added to the Criterion collection, like Carl Theodor Dreyer's The Passion of Joan of Arc. But when we think of the intersection of old Hollywood and the Bible, the first works that most likely come to mind are those of Cecil B. DeMille, who famously said, "Give me any 2 pages of the Bible and I'll give you a picture." And he made good on that promise. Cecil started to incorporate biblical and Christian stories into the pictures he directed as early as the 1910s and 20s, with silent films like King of Kings, which told the story of Jesus, and he even tried his own hand at a Joan of Arc narrative 12 years before Dreyer with the descriptively titled Joan the Woman. But by 1956, DeMille had directed the sweeping, nearly 4-hour-long epic,
The Ten Commandments,
which is his most well-known work and one of the most well-known biblical films of all time. It was, at the time, the most expensive film ever produced, advertised as the greatest event in motion picture history, and it was nominated for Best Picture in the 1957 Academy Awards, as well as receiving nominations for its cinematography, art direction, and set decoration, costuming, sound recording, editing, and winning Best Special Effects. But if we look at the biblical films being produced around this time, they're still a far cry from the Christian films of today that strive so hard to set themselves apart from the secular culture. I mean, these films were studio Hollywood blockbusters, and they still had all the camp, opulence, and scandal of their contemporaries. Yes, you had the Ten Commandments and Ben-Hur, but then you also had Samson and Delilah, David and Bathsheba, Solomon and Sheba, Esther and the King, Salome, which overall tended to be more salacious spectacle than sermon. I mean, there would be some moral teachings shoehorned into a couple scenes, but they were also a lot of,
I've got what I want.
You're all I want.
You, daughter of hell.
and if we step outside of specifically biblical adaptations, in Western film, Christian themes, iconography, and characters have all held genre spanning prevalence pretty much since its inception, from the Sister Act to The Exorcist. But that isn't always enough to earn them the elusive title of Christian film. I mean, even contemporary films based on biblical stories aren't always embraced as Christian, such as Ridley Scott's Exodus, Gods and Kings, or Darren Aronofsky's Noah. So why is that? So how do we even define specifically Christian media, and what shaped those definitions and gave birth to today's Christian film industry as a whole? Well, Ronald Reagan. Like, I'm kidding, but I'm not. Okay, so disclaimer, the history, theology, and the inner workings of the evangelical movement and Christian nationalism are both incredibly dense and expansive and intersectional. So if I were to try to give you anything, then the most basic surface level overview of a tiny bit of that history, we would be here for like 12 hours. And while I'm sure, like, in theory, I could info dump at you on the topic for that long, In practice, Quentin reviews I am not, and also, like, I know you clicked on this video because you want to hear about bad Christian films and not Bill Gothard's whole life story. But to fully understand why these films are the way they are, we need just like a few tiny little decades of cultural context. So feel free to bump up the playback speed if you haven't already, but also like I promise this is the Cliff Notes version of the Cliff Notes version. The book Jesus and John Wayne by Kristen Kobes Dumais, I think, is a great starting point to just kind of get an overview of the history of the evangelical and Christian nationalism movements in the United States. And it was also very helpful in this specific video, as I'm sure you can tell from its title. We also need to nail down some definitions just right off the bat because I am going to be throwing out the terms evangelical, Christian nationalist, dominionist a lot, often in conjunction with each other, but they don't all necessarily mean the same thing. Okay, so starting with evangelical, and we are taking this directly from the National Association of Evangelicals. So on the NAE website, under their statement of faith, they say, "We believe the Bible to be the inspired, the only infallible, authoritative word of God. We believe that there is one God, eternally existent in three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. We believe in the deity of our Lord Jesus Christ, in his virgin birth, his sinless life, in his miracles, in his vicarious atoning death through his shed blood, in his bodily resurrection, in his ascension to the right hand of the Father, and in his personal return in power and glory. We believe that for the salvation of lost and sinful people, regeneration by the Holy Spirit is absolutely essential. We believe in the present ministry of the Holy Spirit, by whose indwelling the Christian is enabled to live a godly life. We believe in the resurrection of both the saved and the lost, they that are saved unto the resurrection of life, and they that are lost unto the resurrection of damnation. We believe in the spiritual unity of believers in our Lord Jesus Christ." So as we can see from this statement of faith, there is no inherent association with any specific political party or stance on social issues or even religious denomination, with quite a few denominations and non-denominational churches falling under this umbrella of evangelical. And you do see a lot of that variety showing up in the history of the evangelical movement, like the liberal evangelical movement. But it tends to be associated with more conservative ideas and politics in today's day and age. Next is Christian nationalist. In her book, Jesus and John Wayne, Kristen Kobes Dumais defines Christian nationalism as the belief that America is God's chosen nation and must be defended as such. It is this intersection and subsequent conflation of faith and politics. So Christian nationalists believe that the United States is inherently a Christian nation, has always been a Christian nation, and must always continue to remain a Christian nation. And now we're moving on to Dominionism. And in the words of Carrie Ladner, writing for the Christian Century, Dominionism is the belief that Christians should take moral, spiritual, and ecclesiastical control over society. So really, Christian dominionism is kind of the more modern, hip, somewhat more palatable rebranding of this movement called Christian Reconstructionism, which is, in essence, a movement towards implementing Old Testament law as the United States' sole governing force. So yes, this does include like dismantling most of the government. The government still exists, I think, to run the military, but they are not socially involved at all. And social authority comes from like the patriarch over a family, the church over a community, and then, of course, like Jesus as king above it all. And also, yes, they are very, very big into stoning. So if you think of like Gilead from The Handmaid's Tale, that's almost a fully Reconstructionist society, but not totally there yet. Like, so Dominionism differs from Reconstructionism in the sense of like, like guys, no, we don't want to abolish the government. God just told us to take it over, and also like take over the rest of society too. All right, so here's how this all breaks down. Evangelical describes theological convictions. Christian nationalism is the intersection of theological and political beliefs, and the belief that the two should not be separated. And Dominionism is kind of this overarching worldview. So keep that in mind, and we're going to move on. Although the roots of the evangelical movement stretch back centuries earlier, the conservative, patriotic, and politically active evangelicism that we think of first today began to really pick up political and cultural steam during the Cold War era, when factors like Billy Graham and the civil rights movement and fear of communism, the post-war economic boom, and the sexual revolution all kind of collided in this perfect storm. The Red Scare is probably one of the best things to ever happen for this militant Christian nationalism. I mean, communist was anti-capitalist, and therefore anti-American, and therefore anti-God, leading to patriotism and faith starting to become inextricably linked. And both politicians and preachers were playing into this. I mean, Billy Graham was one of, if not the most famous evangelist of the 20th century. And just a couple of his word for word quotes on communism include: "Communism is a religion that is inspired, directed, and motivated by the devil himself. Theologically, a communist is an atheist, a despoiler of churches, a murderer of Christians. It is a battle to the death. Either communism must die or Christianity must die." Super chill things to be hearing from this acclaimed preacher when also, oh yeah, Russia has nukes now. So endowing the Cold War with such intense spiritual importance transformed it into not only a war of political ideology, but a direct attack on Christianity. To be truly anti-communist, the United States must further embrace these Christian values, as collective faith was the only thing setting it apart from the devil-worshipping communists. And thus, maintaining these morals became imperative in the fight for the free world. So this political and spiritual instability provided the perfect inroad into the mainstream that evangelicals had been waiting for years. And Christian nationalism was becoming more and more synonymous with both Christianity and patriotism. Under Dwight D. Eisenhower's presidency, who had a close personal relationship with Billy Graham, the phrase "one nation under God" was added to the Pledge of Allegiance in 1954, and in 1955, "In God We Trust" was added to US currency. Graham went on to advise future Republicans on specifically how to win the evangelical vote, including Richard Nixon. So Christian nationalism did receive its fair share of criticism, even from within the evangelical movement. In his keynote address for the 1970 Urbana Conference, Tom Skinner said,
"I disassociate myself from any argument that says a vote for America is a vote for God. I disassociate myself with any argument that says God is on our side. I disassociate myself which says God sends troops to Asia, that God is a capitalist, that God is a militarist, that God is the worker behind our system."
Even Billy Graham came to rethink his outspoken political involvement after the Watergate scandal. But by then, it didn't really matter if he was taking a step back, because the movement that he had played a crucial role in kicking into motion had already gained enough momentum to continue on without him. The family values politics of the 1970s and 1980s came as a direct response to the civil rights, feminism, and sexual liberation movements of the 1960s. Multiple evangelical groups were established with the goal of increasing political involvement, like the Christian Women's Association, the Christian Coalition, and the Moral Majority, which all promoted traditional family and Christian values centered around a patriarchal structure of both the home and society as a whole, and very conservative political beliefs. It was to this growing demographic of moralistic, patriotic, and politically involved evangelicals that Ronald Reagan appealed the most to in the 1980 election. In 1980, preacher James Robinson proclaimed that not voting is a sin against Almighty God. which was a particularly ironic battle cry for this election. But the results of this election cemented the political power and preferences of the new political majority of Christians when Ronald Reagan, who was a divorced former actor and former governor of California, won in an absolute landslide victory against Jimmy Carter, who was a devout Baptist former naval officer and former governor of Georgia. And there were factors completely unrelated to faith that had pretty much already set Carter's campaign up for failure, like the Iranian hostage crisis and the rise of inflation. But the indication of Christian preferences was still very, very telling, as in mass they chose Reagan's promise of an even stronger military and the promotion of traditional values over Carter's demonstrated humanitarian and environmental efforts that stretched back to even his life before being elected into office. In addition to his plans for improving the United States military and economy, during his campaign, Reagan heavily advocated for specifically evangelical talking points like bringing prayer back into school and constitutionally banning abortion. His campaign slogan, "Let's make America great again," appealed to the nostalgic nationalist. And although Reagan didn't ban abortion during either of his terms as president, his further militarization of US foreign policy was received well by conservative nationalists, who were becoming more and more militant in their religious ideology as well. And for this very reason, the end of the Cold War proved to be very briefly disastrous for this group, because without communism, they didn't have a concrete enemy and source of everything wrong in the world to resist anymore. But maybe the real enemy had been inside the United States all along. With the publication of Ralph Epperson's book, The New World Order, came the concentrating of evangelical nationalist anxiety from communism to globalization and the New World Order, which would later sow the seeds for the deep state rhetoric we hear in today's QAnon. So the New World Order was both an outside and an inside threat this time, with both intergovernmental organizations like the UN and forces inside the United States, like the Democrats and the elites, systematically encroaching on Christian nationalist values. So this conflict wasn't playing out in direct military combat, but instead through an equally dire culture war that was taking place in every school and on every television screen. Jerry Falwell was one of the most influential and enthusiastic proponents of this culture war conflict. In 1980, Francis Fitzgerald wrote a New Yorker profile on Jerry Falwell, where Falwell says, "The war is not between fundamentalists and liberals, but between those who love Jesus Christ and those who hate him." And this sentiment does not echo Tom Skinner's preaching 10 years earlier that Jesus Christ is no more a capitalist than he is a socialist or a communist. He is no more a Democrat than he is a Republican. Instead, Jerry's message was very clear. Christianity was no longer just a religion, it was also a political affiliation. And a vote for the Democrats was a vote against Jesus, turning liberals into both the political and the spiritual enemy, as Fitzgerald observes. I'm going to do a kombucha opening ASMR, which is like, this is the most liberal drink there is. Oh, it's not very fizzy. I feel the socialism. The 90s and early 2000s saw this refocused attempt at making conservative evangelical values more relatable and appealing to the younger rising generations. So during this time, we see both the rise of Christian contemporary music and modern purity culture. Through books like I Kissed Dating Goodbye by Joshua Harris and Wait for Me by Rebecca St. James, Programs like True Love Waits and government-funded abstinence-only sex education, a new wave of young culture warriors began to take shape, and just in time. With the attack on the Twin Towers came the next stage in the war on Christianity, prompting a new resurgence of militant evangelical nationalism, and Islam filled the void that communism had left behind. So, throughout this whole evolution of evangelicalism and Christian nationalism, the perception of Jesus had been shifting very drastically, changing from this figure of countercultural compassion and forgiveness and redemption to this hyper masculine warrior who's riding into battle against the forces of evil like communism and the gays. As Dumais puts it, these evangelicals had replaced the Jesus of the Gospels with a vengeful warrior Christ. And this came to be like such a prevalent narrative in the preaching of this time. I am really trying to keep the tangents to a minimum here, but if you want to see how this played out and the very destructive consequences of it, there's a great podcast on this megachurch in Seattle, Mars Hill. I think it's called The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. It's a wonderful podcast series that is really like a deep dive into this hyper masculine, conservative evangelical culture, and it's very fascinating. But since, as Christians, Jesus is who you're striving to embody, this rebrand had massive impacts on all of modern Christianity. In another quote from Jerry Falwell, "The moment you entered the family of God, Satan declared war on you. The Christian life is to be a competitive, combative life." So if you're at all interested in these topics of Christian nationalism and dominionism, there's a good chance you've at least seen scenes from the documentary Jesus Camp, which is a documentary about the Kids on Fire School of Ministry, a former Christian summer camp. And this film is a really hard and, triggering, depending on your past, very hard watch, with just scene after scene of these young children being militarized into this army for God, ready to die in defense of their faith. And even if this ideology doesn't always manifest with this extremity, I remember as a very small child having this martyr narrative impressed upon me. And I remember being taught how crucial it was to be willing to die this horrible death for your faith. Again, I'm like 5 to 10 at this point. And it was to the point, like, it's kind of funny looking back now, but at the time it wasn't. But I had this very deeply internalized anxiety that at any moment, and I cannot emphasize this enough, in suburban Georgia, someone was going to run in, hold a gun to my head, and ask me to renounce my faith. Jerry Falwell really is the gift that keeps on giving, because we're going to wrap this up with another quote from him. "The local church is an organized army equipped for battle, ready to charge the enemy. The Sunday school is the attacking squad." Meanwhile, we're using, like, child terrorists as a justification for bombing out Middle Eastern countries, but okay. In under a century, the predominant narrative of Christianity in America specifically had gone from one of compassion to one of fighting back, and ultimately one of conquest. All right, the 7 Mountain Mandate. All right, so I'm gonna flash up an image on the screen, and this was like such a deep memory, but I know I have seen this before, and it just like, whoa, took me back for a minute. As defined by Justin N. Poythress, I believe, writing for the Gospel Coalition, the 7 Mountain Mandate, or 7 Mountain Prophecy, is a strategy for cultural engagement popularized by Lance Wallnau and Bill Johnson in their 2013 book, Invading Babylon. Proponents of this seven mountain mandate call on Christians to retake seven spheres or mountains of cultural influence, which are religion, family, government, education, media, arts and entertainment, and business. So this, if you remember from the definitions, this is solidly dominionist rhetoric. Also, I am morbidly curious about this book, and I will be reading it. So I will come back to you and denounce my lack of faith if all of this actually makes sense and I'm converted. So, under this dominionist ideology, right, the arts and entertainment industry is not this place for authentic creative expression and collaboration. You're viewing it as a mountain to be conquered. And this heavy handed militant approach predictably is not really going to be received well in an industry populated with theologically diverse contributors and reliant on collaboration above all else to keep a production afloat. So conquering the entertainment industry from the inside out proved to be a lot easier said than done. But if you can't reshape the existing industry in your image, there's always the option of making your own. So through Christian television networks like CBN and TBN, which mainly specialized in televangelism, these variety show type setups, and children's programming, evangelicals had maintained a strong presence on the small screen for years. However, most attempts at full-length films had been both low budget and low profile, appearing either on these networks or going straight to DVD without theatrical releases and widespread recognition. Apparently, there have been a scattering of Christian film festivals, like the Merrimack Valley Christian Film Festival and the San Antonio Independent Christian Film Festival, founded by Vision Forum's Doug Phillips. Yikes. All the websites for these are defunct now, and most of the nominees and winners and just any information about them is incredibly poorly documented anywhere else. Besides like these sketchy Amazon compilation DVDs I found, which sorry, I'm not spending my money on this and a DVD player when I don't even qualify for monetization yet. So clearly these were not culturally significant enough to warrant much further much further research. But nothing we had seen from evangelical filmmakers before would compare with the absolute explosion of Christian-produced films that took place in the 2000s and 2010s. This is gonna be so long! In 2004, The Passion of the Christ, written, directed, and produced by Mel Gibson, was released, and it was a cultural reset. Despite its R-rating, graphic violence, and the fact that Mel Gibson was a Catholic, the film was embraced by the evangelical community. I mean, Billy Graham himself showered Passion with praise in a press release from the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, saying, "I have often wondered what it must have been like to be a bystander during those last hours before Jesus' death. After watching The Passion of the Christ, I feel as if I have actually been there. I was moved to tears. I doubt if there has ever been a more graphic and moving presentation of Jesus' death and resurrection, which Christians believe are the most important events in human history." And Tim LaHaye, who's a political activist, co-author of the Left Behind series, and author of The Unhappy Gays, called Passion Hollywood's finest achievement to date. Also, its box office success gave this new vision for what Christian film could be. It's currently still 9th on the list of highest grossing R-rated films of all time. We will be coming back to The Passion of the Christ a little bit later. But for now, we're going to move on because it wasn't only studio-backed blockbusters that could find success within the evangelical community, as grassroots movements were going mainstream as well. Sherwood Baptist Church is a church in Albany, Georgia. On the doctrinal views and beliefs page of their website, they state, We believe that it is the responsibility and privilege of every Christian to proclaim the good news of Jesus Christ and to seek to make growing disciples. And perhaps no one in their congregation would take those words to heart quite as publicly and creatively as the Kendrick brothers. So, Alex Kendrick was the associate pastor of media at Sherwood, and Stephen Kendrick was the associate pastor of preaching and prayer. So, in 2002, Alex pitched this idea of creating full-length films as tools of ministry. In 2003, the first of these, Flywheel, was released and Sherwood Pictures was founded, which would go on to produce Facing the Giants in 2006, Fireproof in 2008, which would go on to be one of the few documented winners of the San Antonio Independent Christian Film Festival that I could find. And finally, Courageous in 2011. So these films were true indie productions, at first funded mostly by congregant donations and staffed with volunteers, which past a certain point I do have some feelings about, especially when these films went on to bring in literal millions of dollars. So on their own page, Sherwood Productions states that Facing the Giants was made with a slew of Sherwood volunteers and 5 paid professionals who led the production teams, and then goes on to state in the next paragraph, Facing the Giants exceeded box office expectations, earning $10.1 million in theaters and selling more than 2.5 million units on DVD. So, okay, sure, but no one was expecting the success. So, as their budgets continued to increase for future projects, of course they'd start paying their crew members, right? In September 2007, with Provident Films as partner, the camera rolled on Fireproof using a dozen professionals, 1,200 volunteers, and a budget of $500,000. So, okay, here's the thing. $500,000 is a relatively low budget for a feature film, but it's not completely unheard of. I mean, obviously this was a non-union production, but a $500,000 budget would put this production squarely in the range of a SAG moderate low budget agreement, which is not even the lowest option for a SAG contract. And under this agreement, performers should be making 35% of SAG basic theatrical rates. So in fall of 2007, when Fireproof was shot, the SAG basic theatrical rates were $759 daily or $2,634 weekly, which means that on any union film with a similar budget, actors should be making either $265 per day or $921 a week. But Fireproof was shot with all volunteer actors. None of them were professional besides Kirk Cameron, who starred in it. So I feel you could make the argument yeah, they weren't professionals though, and the quality of work reflects that. But I feel that's not really relevant because they were still performing hours and hours of labor in order to turn a profit, with reports of up to 13-hour days. So I found this interview with the leading actress, Erin Bethea, where she states that she quit her job and lost her health insurance, all to act in Fireproof. And also on set, she was basically the makeup department, also unpaid. I don't know, my exploiting actors bell is kind of going off right now. But again, these are all adults. They can make their own decisions. Or so I thought. Because this article, it just keeps getting worse and worse. With quotes like, homeschooled kids in our church were holding lights for the movie. So now we're bringing unpaid child labor into it. And also do you know how dangerous gaffing is? Do you know how much could go wrong? With have you seen professional lighting setups? They are so lucky that their asses didn't get sued for every dollar of the over $33 million that Fireproof brought into the box office. And now you're probably thinking, okay, well, yeah, Fireproof made $33 million in the box office, so surely they're net. In 2010, 28 professionals and 1,700 volunteers began production on Courageous with a budget of $1 million. So yes, the success of the Kendrick brothers was unprecedented at the time, but You forgot I wrote this. But their media empire, built on the backs of unpaid homeschooled child laborers, served to merely clear the way for the true conqueror of Mount Entertainment. In his own words, David A.R. White is a storyteller by nature. He tells many stories through his acting, producing, and filmmaking. David has been building his career in the film industry for more than 20 years. So, through the 90s and early 2000s, David was like a solidly working actor with an admittedly pretty impressive resume of co-star and guest star roles. But that big break that every actor dreams about never quite came, at least not within the liberal cesspool of mainstream media. So, leaving the secular industry behind, in 2005, David co-founded the production and distribution studio Pureflix Entertainment, which is now known as Pinnacle Peak Pictures, apparently. So he co-founded this with Russell Wolfe, another actor and producer, and Randy Travis, who's like a pretty prolific country singer who's also had numerous acting roles. So, all right, the history of Pureflix can be split into these two distinct eras. So you've got before God's Not Dead, BGND, a time of scarcity and struggle, and then the years after God's Not Dead, AGND, the growth of an empire. Early Pureflix productions included Home Beyond the Sun, which was released in the year 10 BGND, Sarah's Choice, released in 5 BGND, and Jerusalem Countdown, released in 3 BGND. According to their website, the company's early productions were primarily distributed through churches, limited theatrical releases, or direct-to-DVD retail sales. And a quote from White states that those early years were always a struggle. So despite the financial struggle of the BGND era, David always had really big dreams for the Pureflix brand, ministry. In a 2013 interview with World News, David stated, "We want Pureflix to be a household name, a trusted partnership. You know what you're getting when you watch a Pureflix movie. It's kind of like the Disney brand, but more faith and family." So that's the goal of Pureflix, just to make it viable to where it's everywhere. Just like the Netflix app, there would be a Pureflix app with everything that's faith. And that goal was about to be realized. In 2014, God's Not Dead was released, and this single film catapulted Pureflix and everyone involved into a new age of widespread fame and success. God's Not Dead earned over $9 million on its opening weekend with a limited theatrical release, going on to gross over $64 million worldwide, earning back over 32 times its budget of $2 million. It birthed an entire franchise, and the God's Not Dead films remain Pureflix's most popular output, and the newfound financial and popular success enabled Pureflix to launch their streaming platform of the same name in 2015, which now apparently has rebranded to Great American Pureflix. Cool. So the success of Pureflix was the culmination of victory after victory on the mountain of entertainment, and it appeared that the war was almost won. But still, the common enemy of God, Alex Kendrick, and David A.R. White held fast. Because the devil still walks the earth, but his preferred human manifestation is no longer a businessman or lawyer or even fiddle player down in Georgia. No, now when the devil elects to take on the form of man, there's only one occupation he's interested in: film critic. So, objectively, a lot of these films aren't great. If we look at the critical reception to some of the aforementioned films, it ranges from all right to abysmal. But, critical reception and audience reception have never had like a one-to-one correlation across any genre, but this has really never been more clear than in the modern Christian film industry. The Amazon reviews of these films tell a much different story. And even if we want to take like professional critics out of it and compare Amazon reviews to Letterboxd reviews, God's Not Dead has a 4.8 on Amazon and a whopping 1.5 on Letterboxd. And not that Letterboxd is like the epitome of fair and honest critique, but I think it's a really interesting comparison that shows how localized the bubbles of praise surrounding these films are. Fireproof earns a mere 38% on Rotten Tomatoes, which still puts it at like the higher end of the ratings of a lot of these films. But it also boasts a 4.8 on Amazon. And it even went on to have its own spin off self help book, The Love Dare, which itself has almost 10,000 5-star reviews on Amazon. Any amount of secular criticism was not going to stop the Christian media machine from churning out these products and making absolute bank while doing it. But I think there's a much more important element to the tension between critical and audience reception at play here, and one that goes past normal disagreements between critics and consumers. Because in this case, too, both the creators and consumers, it's not just their media being criticized. It's everything they believe in, their entire worldview. So now we're going to briefly travel back to the 20th century, because there actually is a old Hollywood spiritual precursor for the Christian film industry of today. But it's not found in DeMille's biblical epics. It's found in the propaganda films of John Wayne. Though not particularly religious, John Wayne was a staunch conservative and anti-communist, co-creating the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals in 1944. But the prolific film actor was also a much less prolific director, only going on to direct 2 films, The Alamo, released in 1960, and The Green Berets, released in 1968, both being basically military propaganda films that were poorly received by critics. But to Wayne's primary audience, that did not matter. Quoting Jesus and John Wayne, yet again, Dumais says, to conservatives, the fact that both films were viciously panned and vilified, dismissed as rightist message films and artistic duds, was another point in their favor. Even more confirmation that cultural elites disdained heroic masculinity. Like the heroes Wayne played on screen, conservative sense of embattlement only heightened their resolve. And we're seeing the same thing in front of us on Amazon review pages today. The persecution... Okay, this is a lot of talking. This ridicule of Christian films from secular sources only further confirms the persecution narratives that play out in various degrees of subtlety throughout many of these scripts, and through the previously discussed decades of right-wing fear-mongering. Persistent negative reviews and the climate of the modern entertainment industry in general finally give middle-class white evangelical Christians a genuine opportunity to feel like an underdog. And people want to feel this triumph of beating the odds. They want to relate to the underdog protagonist. They don't want to see themselves in the big mean judge taking people's rights away. They want to be the scrappy hometown hero fighting for justice. But in the Western world, in the United States of America, if you look at the current realities of how the government and evangelical Christianity are linked, that story can't play out for a conservative audience in this reality. So that's how you end up with these various AU fanfiction versions of the United States where white middle-class Christians are the most oppressed group. And okay, also, to play Jesus' advocate, I do kind of want to validate this narrative of Christians and conservatives being underrepresented in the secular film industry, because they're in the Supreme Court instead. So I wasn't able to find like a census of the religious affiliations of like everyone in industry unions, but I can speak from my own personal experiences being on set. where I have not met very many conservatives or evangelicals, at least not many that are very vocal about it. There have been a couple that are, and they have made quite the impression, but I think we need to examine the reasoning on this too. And, there are other possibilities besides anyone who dares to say grace at Crafty being like blacklisted from the industry for the rest of their lives. So, is there really this liberal agenda to shun all Christians from the entertainment industry? Or do Christians tend to self isolate? I think, first of all, in general, if you're growing up with less conservative ideology and less conservative expectations placed on you, there's less of this emphasis of, living out your white picket fence American dream, which I think is a big part of leading a greater number of non conservatives to gravitate to the non traditional, very unstable career paths of the arts. Also, in the conservative and dominionist spaces I grew up in, including some Christian arts programs, entering the entertainment industry was only really encouraged under the precedent of like doing missionary work there, basically. And, we've already talked about how this like bulldozing, conquering ideology does not really fly in the world of film, like, especially at the entry level jobs you're going to have to work your way up through if you're not a Nepo baby. Like, you can't be pushing your own agenda through that. I do I do also think the conservative demonization of the secular entertainment industry turns into this like self-fulfilling prophecy. The 2013 film Grace Unplugged is the story of Grace Trey, the daughter of a former rock star turned worship leader after becoming a born-again Christian. So in the film, Grace teams up with her dad's old manager and travels to LA to begin a career of her own, very quickly starting to find worldly success, but also discovering how morally bankrupt Hollywood is when she is asked to be in a PR relationship and sing a song about a one night stand. And I mean, okay, look, obviously, yes, there is so much corruption and exploitation going on in the entertainment industry. I just think this specific example is kind of funny because, with it being a Christian film, it kind of like neuters the examples of exploitation and sexualization, which makes its message like a lot less convincing than it could have been. And of course, the moral to this ends up being your dad is always right. Worldly success means nothing compared to your eternal salvation. And then Grace leaves LA to come back to her family and church and get married. And I think there was the opportunity for a really compelling narrative here about sticking to your faith even when it's not mirrored by everyone around you and like existing in the secular space. But, instead the overall message is just stay far away. Also, it is fair to say that Christians are the butt of a lot of jokes in media, and, yes, it genuinely sucks to get made fun of. So I'm empathetic to that, especially, having lived it too. But that's still technically punching up because politically and culturally in the USA, evangelical Christians are not a marginalized group. So, can it be mean spirited and unnecessary sometimes? Of course. And I'm not defending that, but there's a lot of mean spirited and unnecessary jabs at like everyone, every group of people throughout all of film and media. And Ned Flanders is not religious persecution that's threatening any aspect of your life past whether or not you can still enjoy The Simpsons,
And Harry Potter and all his wizard friends went straight to hell for practicing witchcraft.
Richard Propez of The Independent Critics says of God's Not Dead, it's a film made by Christians for Christians. And I think that kind of sums up the entire ethos of most modern Christian media. Despite, being touted as these vehicles for bringing the gospel to those who might not otherwise engage with it via the entertainment industry, that justification starts to very, very quickly fall apart when we take a deeper look at the actual content of some of these films. So let's finally do that. Freshman university student Josh Wheaton, not to be confused with Josh Whedon, attends a philosophy class where Professor Radisson requires all students to submit a signed statement saying God is dead and never existed. When Josh refuses because of his own beliefs, the professor challenges him to defend his position, which leads to a series of confrontational presentations between himself and the professor, with the class as a jury. It is also the first and hopefully last film that in my notes I've ever written should be less diverse about. It was like watching a film from the 60s or something with like incredibly stereotypical, insensitive racial caricatures, and then everyone around you watching is like, oh well, it was a different time, we have to keep in mind that it was a different time. But this was made in 2014, so there's no justification for this. All right, so Josh Whedon, who was played by Shane Harper, is the protagonist, and that is all there is to him. There's nothing else you need to know. He's basically just this perfect little Christian boy, okay? But the real star of the show is Mr. Radisson, who's played by Kevin Sorbo, our comically evil, liberal atheist professor, who actually also is an anti-theist, not just an atheist. I wrote down Batman villain-ass motherfucker, and that is not an exaggeration at all. I mean, he is menacingly slow clapping down the stairs. He is lurking in elevators. He's calling himself God.
In that classroom, there is a God, and yet I'm him.
This man is just one bad day away from poisoning the water supply, and I love him for it. What I don't love is how he's also a predator who's dating one of his former students, and it seems like they started dating when she was a student, and she's a Christian. And his favorite pastimes, like anytime he's not in the classroom, he's just being an asshole with this band of elitist academic goons that like constantly surrounds him, and they just like and they're just like, all they talk about is how stupid the concept of God is. Like, they have no other interests.
God isn't dead.
They have no other life. Also, his mom died when he was just a little boy, and that's literally his only like humanizing characteristic, and that's why he hates God so much, because he like prayed and his mom still died. Okay. So here's the thing. So the actual philosophy and theology brought up in this film is very, very basic, which can be expected to some extent, because it is a family movie. So you have to suspend your disbelief a little with the knowledge that like there's only so existential they can get. However, the fact that this brilliant philosophy professor, who like everyone around us is acting like is Plato reincarnated, basically, the fact that his understanding of God and the concept of God and like everything that God could be is limited to, and these are direct quotes, a supreme celestial dictator and imaginary grandfather in the sky. I mean, this is like This is like baby's first foray into atheism, you know? Like, these are the arguments you'd hear from a 13-year-old who's rebelling against their religious upbringing because honestly, like, the film is not equipped to handle anything stronger than that. So ultimately, this plot climaxes in a screaming match, honestly, during Josh's last presentation, where any valid arguments that Radisson does bring up are just like blown past without any examination as like the pacing keeps ramping up and up and up. And ultimately just ends with Josh yelling, "Why do you hate God?" at him over and over and over until Radisson finally snaps and just replies with, "Because he took everything from me."
Why do you hate God?
Because singing killed my grandma, okay?
And then there's this, like, the room goes silent, and there's this poignant pause. And then in the ultimate mic drop moment, Josh asks,
How can you hate someone if they don't exist?
Got him!
the Christians win, and we can all rest easy knowing that God is, in fact, not dead. So, Professor Radisson is the perfect handcrafted atheist insert for this Tumblr post-esque script because he's not an atheist at all. If he were, if he genuinely did not believe in the existence of God, these Gotham arguments would not land at all and Josh wouldn't win. If you go out and just ask your average neighborhood atheist why they hate God, their response would be that they don't because God doesn't exist. I mean, yes, there are a lot of people out there who do have anger towards God, or, who have a lot of anger towards religion while still not believing in God. At that point, I mean, if this many people have such strong negative feelings about religion, I think it's, worth examining why religion hurts so many people too. But there are also a lot of people who are just, out there chilling, not believing in God, for any number of reasons that this movie doesn't even dare to dip its toe into. This debate doesn't own atheists because there was no atheist in this debate. The script isn't even open enough to considering the idea of God not being real to even have its antagonists genuinely believe that, or have any of the atheist characters genuinely believe that. So the other atheist character is this very liberal reporter. What does she write for? It's called like The New Liberal or The New Left or something. That's the magazine she works for. I don't know. But what matters is that both she and Professor Radisson are like almost sadistically murdered by the plot in order to give either David A.R. White's self-insert character or the band The Newsboys this wish fulfillment fantasy chance of like bagging a soul for the Lord on its way to death. And it's just very gruesome and horrific to watch from an outside perspective. At least with the reporter, she does seem to be, genuinely questioning. She does kind of like corner the newsboys in their green room and start interrogating them about their faith. And then they start asking her about her faith, and then she opens up that she's dying from cancer. And then they convert her, and they all pray together. Professor Radisson gets hit by a car in this truly jaw-dropping shot. This character, played by David A.R. White, and his friend, who have just been like this silly side plot the entire rest of the film, rush in and like pressure conversion on him as he is dying this horrific death.
His ribs are crushed. His lungs are filling with blood.
Like, instead of comforting him or anything.
It's all right.
a few minutes, you're gonna know more about God than I do, or anybody else here does. It's okay.
So the film also makes the claim that the only reason for morals is God. Like, God is the only reason we have morality, which is just so untrue and not a academically respected or supported position at all. Like, I just happened to be reading like a secular book on moral psychology during this, so I was like, whoa, 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 whoa. Morality has played such a huge role in like our development as a species, our development of society, and I don't know, just this implication that the only reason we're not running around like it's the purge every day is because we're being like divinely babysat is just, it's such a nihilistic view of humanity, really, but it is one that a lot of Christians have. If you believe that every baby that comes out of the womb is already inherently sinful, that is like the logical progression. It's one that's really sad. Like, it's a sad way to look at the world, and it's a sad way to grow up. And like, it's why now I'm in EMDR therapy, trying to like uninternalize this belief that like at my core I am just bad. But of course, this movie really plays into the not even God equals morality, but Christianity specifically equals morality, because every single non Christian character is either this morally bankrupt caricature, like this guy who literally exists solely to dump basically his sugar baby, who is the reporter, is the second she tells him she has cancer, and then to like taunt his mom with dementia about her faith. Well, so you either get that, you get Professor Radisson, you get this combative reporter, or you get a abusive religious extremist. The final thing I want to talk about in God's Not Dead is the scene, or actually just a couple lines, really. Okay, so the Duck Dynasty Robertsons make quite a few cameos throughout this. It was a film made for evangelicals in 2014, so of course they did. So they're walking into church. The reporter comes up and like corners them and is asking all these hard-hitting questions, but of course they have like all the perfect answers, because this is just like an apologetics wish fulfillment fantasy. Every scene in this movie is. And then she asks them,
so what do you say to people who are offended by your show, not just because of the hunting, but because you openly pray to Jesus in every episode?
I am not going to say that no one was upset about the Robertsons, praying on camera in Duck Dynasty, because like some people are genuinely just haters. That was not the problem that most people had with them, though. And like, listen, you're allowed to hold your own political beliefs, and you are allowed to be as vocal about them as you want, okay? Like, it is a free country. You don't have to like the gays, right? But like, stand up, and accept that like, likewise, people are allowed to not like you, and they're allowed to have their own thoughts and feelings and negative reactions to those beliefs, and what you say has consequences. You're still allowed to say it, but that doesn't mean you say it in a vacuum. That's not what free speech does not mean free of responsibility and free of consequences. And then to paint all of this as religious oppression is just inaccurate. You don't have to hold bigoted beliefs just because you're Christian, and you don't have to be a Christian to be a bigot. They are not like inextricably linked. And it is just such a bad faith argument. Like, it's so disingenuous for both the creators of God's Not Dead and the Robertsons to paint their controversy that they'd been in as people being upset that they prayed to Jesus, when they both know that that's not the real problem. But it also shows this level of cognitive dissonance and insulation in the audiences who are consuming just this bubble of media and who will believe that narrative. So, okay, there are, as of recording this, 4 God's Not Dead films, 1 more on the way. Listen, the alcoholism gene does run in my family, and like an 8-hour marathon of all of these just seems very irresponsible, very much like tempting fate. So I figured, like, what would give me the broadest, most comprehensive view of the God's Not Dead films and how they have progressed is to watch the first one and then the most recent one. So we just talked about the first one, and now we're going to move on to the IMDb logline is, I mean, it sounds like what David A.R. White like scribbled down when he was half awake at 3 a.m. for the idea for the next installment. It just says, Reverend Dave defending himself and a group of Christian homeschooling families after the inspection by the local government official. Cool. But okay, the official synopsis. The God's Not Dead franchise continues in God's Not Dead, We the People, as Reverend Dave White is called to defend a group of Christian homeschooling families. He finds himself taken aback by the interference of the government, and believing that their right to educate their own children is a freedom worth fighting for, Reverend Dave is called to Washington, D.C. to testify in a landmark congressional hearing that will determine the future of religious freedom in our country for years to come. I have been hiding something from you all. I am a former homeschooler. Ugh, I know, you never would have been able to tell. I just seem like so cool and chill and well adjusted, and this is such a normal topic to write a 35-page script on. So, like, there are no signs. But yeah, so I was homeschooled all of elementary school, middle school, and then in high school, I went to this performing arts conservatory and did online school because it took place like during normal school hours. So yeah, never been to public school. This isn't a therapy session, but just know that like it is something I talk about in therapy. No, my thoughts and feelings about it are very, very mixed. In a sense, especially once I was older and like making the choice myself, I do feel like it was kind of a privilege to focus on something I was passionate about so intensely, and I am grateful that homeschooling and online school like gave me the opportunity to do that. But also just growing up in that, and just knowing that like everyone thinks you're weird, you're different, growing up internalizing that while also not having the same opportunities for social interaction and development as like your peers. It'll do some things to you. It'll do some things to you up in here, and they're not all going to be great. Obviously everyone's experience is different. It's not really something I would consider a super positive experience in my life. So this was a lot. But also, like, because of that, I have been in the trenches. I have all their insider information. And the narratives that they're painting in the script are ones that I grew up hearing about from like these Christian homeschool circles, but they're not ones that either reflect reality or like ever in any sense like threaten to manifest in our lives. So Reverend Dave, who is David A.R. White's self-insert character, I guess is like the star of the show now. Like he went from side character and now he is, it seems like in every other God's Not Dead film, he's like front and center. So good for him, I guess. And the other Oh my god, this was devastating to me because the main homeschooled mom protagonist character is played by Francesca Battistelli. So imagine my shock and horror and betrayal when I saw that as someone who grew up like free to be me is still branded into my brain after growing up like in the conservative Christian 2000s, 2010s. So that, oh my god, that hurt. I mean, there's so little to actually say about this one because most of the script genuinely feels like a satirical SNL sketch about crazy homeschoolers, and at some points it's delivered with about the same sincerity. Like this clip I'm gonna show now.
I don't have the money to pay for those kinds of fines. None of us do.
Well, that's it. We're gonna enroll our kids into Oakwood on Monday. Look at this. You know the Andersons, right? Okay, all their kids go to Oakwood. Maddie Anderson brought that home from school. This is an advertisement for birth control. Yeah. They passed it out in class. Maddie's in the 2nd grade. He's 7.
Tell me this is not a cut for time YouTube upload. But, I mean, this movie actively made me feel like I was losing my mind, quite frankly. Partially because I had to speed it up to 1.25 times speed to even just make it through. So that really did like enhance the fever dream aspect of it all. But mostly because the antagonist characters, like they would have the most sane, non-controversial, centrist take. And then it would get, like, within the world of the script, it would get treated like 1984 manifesting in front of our eyes. So I'm gonna show some examples of that.
Their teachable moment from the no myth is obey God or die.
I mean, that's one way to look at it.
Parents have the freedom to raise their children in line with their moral and religious beliefs. Your children, however, enjoy the right to an education. Your freedoms as parents do not supersede your children's rights.
How do you answer the comment by former U.S. Commission on Civil Rights Chairman Martin Castro? And here I quote, "The phrases religious liberty and religious freedom will stand for nothing except hypocrisy as long as they remain code words for discrimination, intolerance, racism, sexism, homophobia, Islamophobia, or any form of intolerance."
But of course, anytime a evil deep state operative would manage to say something sane like that, it of course would need to be followed up by something as ominous as,
After all, the children belong to all of us.
or as inflammatory as,
Homeschooling is separatist, elitist, and racist, Kayla.
the deflection reaches a truly astounding, mind-bending level here. One could say astronomical. Oh, that joke is going to be really funny in about 5 seconds. When at the congressional hearing that Pastor Dave and these homeschooling parents are attending to defend their rights and their qualifications to homeschool, one of the mothers reveals herself to be a literal rocket scientist for NASA, who only switched jobs because her husband died in military service and she needed to be with her special needs son more frequently. And then she goes into this oral dissertation about all the Christian astronauts that there have been around the world. So this is what's known as a red herring fallacy. And Logically Fallacious defines a red herring fallacy as a deliberate diversion of attention with the intention of trying to abandon the original argument. So, in this case, the fallacy is, oh, you think homeschooling parents can't always provide a competent education for their children? Well, look at all these religious astronauts. So even within the convoluted world of the script, this feels entirely out of left field because it has absolutely nothing to do with what is actually being argued. Like, the argument has never been Christians fundamentally can't learn science, okay? I mean, If the story was about someone getting denied admittance to like an aerospace engineering program because they mention being Christian in their admissions essay, which don't you dare use that without giving me a writer's credit. Or, if Buzz Aldrin was homeschooled, he was not. Yes, this could be a relevant argument, but this has nothing to do with the question of should there be some universal education requirements for those who choose to homeschool. I do feel like my siblings and I were very lucky in the sense that both my parents had strong educations, and my mom was literally a doctor before deciding to homeschool. But that's not the universal experience. Like, rocket scientists and ophthalmologists do not make up the majority of conservative Christian homeschoolers. And actually, homeschooling is like a state by state issue. There are not federal regulations that I could find. I don't know. I went to the HSLDA. Ooh, that also took me back. Their website to look at the requirements for Georgia specifically because that is where I was homeschooled. And there are so this is Georgia is like listed as a low regulation state, and the requirements are that, whoever's homeschooling needs to be the parent or legal guardian of a child and have a high school diploma or GED. You do have to submit a annual declaration of intent, which is just letting the Department of Education know that you're homeschooling. You need to like provide the required numbers of school days. You need to teach some required subjects, which are really just like the bare basics. Write progress reports, and then takes standardized testing every so often, which is very reasonable, I think. But there are so many states where either there are no education requirements for the homeschooling instructor, and there are 11 where you don't even need to notify anyone that you are like pulling your children out to homeschool. There are only 4 states that are listed as high regulation. I think Washington has the strictest guidelines for what makes a homeschooling parent competent. So there's 4 requirements. You must either be supervised by a certified person, or have achieved a minimum number of college credits, or taken a course in home-based instruction, or been deemed qualified by the local school board. Which even that I don't feel is like that crazy of an ask if you are like educating a child, I don't know, maybe the liberals got me, but and the standardized tests are the arguments that keep getting brought up over and over again in favor of homeschooling in this movie, which I find interesting because isn't there this whole movement against standardized testing going on right now? Specifically because these tests don't like comprehensively reflect the quality of education that children are getting. I did really well on any standardized tests I took. Like, I'm just a good test taker. But I still feel like because the curriculum that I was taught with had such a religious tilt to it, like I feel like there were, pretty big gaps in my education that weren't going to show up in my ACT score, and that I have had to be very intentional about remedying on my own ever since. Yes, I learned proper grammar. I learned math. I learned chemistry equations. But in anything like humanities or history or like health class, oh my God. Like anything history or humanities related was basically all taught like in relation to the Bible, through like ancient history, all in relation to the Bible. And then past that, related to the growth of Christianity, and then, America. Like, the demonization of CPS in this is definitely a choice, since its main role as an organization is to specifically protect children from abuse. Weird thing to kind of try to demonize, especially when there is a demonstrated link between religious fundamentalism and child abuse. With best-selling parenting books within the fundamentalist Christian space, like How to Train Up a Child by the Pearls, heavily advocating for corporal punishment as both biblical and necessary to break the will of children. And no, I'm not saying that all homeschoolers, or even most, like beat their children, but the isolation of homeschooling does add this extra layer of protection for people who are abusing their children. Plus, according to this website ProPublica, um, which is actually a lot more intuitive in layout than HSLDA and has just like all the homeschooling requirements in this one chart. But according to them, only 2 states prohibit some parents from homeschooling based on their criminal history or of that of someone living in the home. In the other 48 states, parents' criminal history cannot legally be used as a reason to prevent them from homeschooling. And I don't think I need to explain why this is very concerning. And I am not saying that there are no systemic issues within CPS, but I am saying that they do not inordinately affect white middle-class Christian homeschoolers. So yeah, this film ends with much more of a political call to action. I mean, they're not even like trying to hide the Dominionist slant anymore. They directly reference the mountain of politics or government, I think.
As believers, we've abandoned the mountain of politics for far too long.
And at some point through these 4 films, I feel like God's Not Dead strayed so far away from its original concept and the literal title that Jesus and even God himself are barely present in this film. I mean, they're like referenced to kind of as this like mascot, but that's really it. It is about this persecution narrative of conservatives who call themselves Christians, but what does this really have to do with the core beliefs of Christianity? Okay, hi. Editing me here. I just feel like I need to emphasize even more just how much like Christian nationalist propaganda is in this film, because I feel like I didn't really make that a point in the script proportionally to like how much it is in the movie. So I'm gonna show the end, like the ending sequence in a second. So just take that energy and like transpose it onto everything else, and that's it. But yeah, I think what it basically is God's Not Dead is not really about God anymore. It is about the religion of this fantasy of a conservative America. Yeah.
We, the people.
So I would say these 2 films are modern morality plays, but instead of teaching lessons, it's really just self-congratulatory virtue signaling for hours and hours. I mean, the flawed logic of these films goes widely unexamined by their audiences because even though they're basically just the films are just people arguing for a couple hours, the target audiences don't need to be convinced of anything. They just want their own pre-existing beliefs validated, and that's exactly what these films set out to do in the first place. I don't think this persecution complex is the only reason that Christians are hesitant to critique Christian media. Yes, there is this perceived external conflict that, they all need to band together in resistance of, but I think it has to do a lot with a more personal, internalized conflict as well. We, and, me speaking as we, being someone who was in these environments, we forget that these movies are not completely divine revelations from God. They are man-made products made by humans. It's not blasphemy to critique them, but I think that is often the attitude surrounding these projects, especially when they have to do directly with Jesus. So I'm going to talk about the Passion of the Christ now. But this I'm a little nervous about. Because Passion of the Christ, I feel like, has risen to, well, not really risen to, it kind of burst onto the scene with this status of being above criticism. And I think it's garnered this reverence that it does not necessarily deserve. I know, at least in like the evangelical circles and churches I grew up in, that was definitely the case. It was viewed as almost like this initiation into the next step of your faith. Like, you could not reach spiritual maturity without watching The Passion of the Christ. I have watched this film, I think at least twice, and I had the same general reaction both times, except like the first time I watched it, I was like, no, I can't. This is completely invalid. I can't think this. Like, I think the main issue I have with this film is how it focuses on really only specifically the mortality of Jesus, instead of the humanity of Jesus, which are two very different things. And I feel like it fixates on Jesus's mortality in a way that's almost objectifying. Like, within the film, Jesus is reduced to an object that exists merely to suffer for the full runtime. And within that, like, his humanity is lost. We do get like some flashbacks. And I think there's more, like, Mary is humanized, but I don't feel like that really extends to Jesus as much. I feel like for Jesus specifically, this film is almost ironically lacking in compassion. Like, it does not feel like a compassionate portrayal of Jesus and of his death at all, which I say is ironic because, compassion is like widely agreed upon to be one of Jesus's like defining characteristics. It feels like it's exploiting the pain Jesus went through. However, since it is about Jesus and allegedly historically accurate to his brutal execution, I feel like that's where the sense that critique equals blasphemy comes from, or critique of this portrayal equals disrespecting the sacrifice he made. And we lose the fact that this is still a man-made film, and all the artistic choices in this portrayal were chosen by a man. And I think this all comes back to one of the core messages of God's Not Dead 1, or I probably the entire franchise, which is
God wants someone to defend him.
Any criticism of these films is viewed as criticizing God. And to question the gratuitous portrayal of Jesus' suffering is to question Jesus himself. To question this shaky theology and philosophy Josh Whedon uses to prove that God is not dead is to side with Radisson in insisting that he is. And obviously this isn't a logical view of media critique, but religion and faith and God are all such emotional and personal and charged topics that we can't expect our response to them to be purely logical. And to illustrate this, I mean, think of those Facebook memes. I will deny those who deny me. I mean, logically, yes, we know this is engagement bait. But like, I want you to be honest right now and think about it. If you are or were raised Christian, even knowing that, do these still trigger some guilt and anxiety when they pop up? Because I know years into deconstruction, they still do for me. They are curated to tap into both religious conviction and anxiety. And I think Christian media can tend to have the same underlying message in how it's received. Scroll if you hate God, leave a 5-star review on Amazon to secure your place in the kingdom of heaven. Throughout the entire research and writing process on the script, my mind kept going back to this video essay I'd watched by the creator, Aini, called China Has a Soft Power Deficiency. And I definitely recommend watching the entire thing. But it's about why China hasn't really been able to export its media into the West at the same level of, say, South Korea or Japan, because this media is so steeped in propagandist messaging. And though they ended up here in a much different way, ironically, I think this is the exact same issue that modern evangelical film is running into. Even though the evangelical movement came to prominence in resistance of communism, it's like they went so far in the opposite direction that they ended up back at the top of the circle. They they were so ahead of the curve that the curve became a spear, one might say. If we take a look through a list of propaganda techniques, they're going to look suspiciously familiar. I mean, name calling or stereotyping, deification, artificial dichotomy, fear. Take any one of these out of a God's Not Dead movie and you won't have a script. The thing about wrapping this up is I have no critique to give that hasn't already been given over and over. There have been so many people that have pointed out the issues with these films and how to fix them, and yet the films are still following the same formula and preaching the same messages. It really doesn't matter what I say in this video. It doesn't matter what anyone else who's made a video essay on the topic have said. The evangelical film industry is not going to change until they want to, and they're not going to want to until they need to. And right now, if we look at the success of the films that are coming out, they don't need to. Is the real goal of these films outreach and expansion, or is it just to create a further and further insulated entertainment market for Christians by Christians? No matter what the starting intentions, I think it's clear where the priorities lie now.